The wrong stop at the edge of everything. Nobody came to Vithara Station by choice. That was the first thing Rael Doss noticed when he landed, the way everyone moved through the docking bays like they were already somewhere else. Heads down, eyes forward, the particular posture of people who had made peace with disappointment and were simply waiting for the next one. He understood the feeling. He had been wearing it for years. His ship, the Steadfast Complaint, settled into Bay 14 with the slow, labored dignity of a machine that had survived more than it was built for. The landing struts groaned. A secondary stabilizer made a sound Rael chose not to investigate. He sat in the pilot seat for a moment, listening to the hull cool, ticking and contracting like old knuckles, and reminded himself why he had stopped here at all. Fuel, water filtration cartridges, something edible that didn't come from a compression pouch. Vithara orbited a dim yellow star at the far edge of Drassian Confederacy space, technically neutral, practically forgotten, the kind of place empires used as a footnote and traders used as a shortcut. The market district was 3 levels down from the docking platforms, buried inside the station's pressurized core, where the air smelled of recycled warmth and fried starchweed. Rael pulled on his jacket, gray, worn at the elbows, with a magnetic patch over the left shoulder that had lost its charge years ago, and made his way down. The market was alive in the way only crossroads places managed. Every species the Confederacy had absorbed or tolerated or barely tolerated was represented in some form. Tall Drassians in their layered gray robes, moving with that slow, deliberate elegance that always made Rael feel like he was rushing, even when he was standing still. Short, wide-built Harith merchants shouting prices in 2 languages simultaneously, a cluster of Vayan traders whose bioluminescent markings pulsed with what might have been conversation, and scattered among all of it, humans, drifters, technicians, medics, laborers, blending the way humans always did, present everywhere, noticed nowhere. Rael was browsing a rack of filtration parts when the market changed. It wasn't loud, that was the thing. It went quieter. Conversation dropped by degrees like someone slowly turning down a signal. Footsteps slowed. The Harith vendor beside him stopped mid-sentence and didn't finish it. Rael looked up. At the far end of the central concourse, a procession had entered. Armed escorts in articulated black armor, moving in perfect 2x2 formation. Between them walked a figure that did not require the guards to command attention. She simply had it, the way a gravitational body had it, without effort, without announcement. She was Drassian. Tall, pale gray skin smooth as polished stone, the characteristic bone-ridge crests above her temples catching the market's overhead lights. She wore no formal robes today, only dark-fitted garments and a single silver clasp at her throat, but the way everyone around Rael went still told him exactly who she was. Empress Regent Sorvan Fel, ruler of the Drassian Confederacy's home territories, the woman who ended the peripheral wars through a combination of strategy, patience, and a reputation for remembering every single person who had ever wronged her. Rael looked back at the filtration rack. He had a strict policy about powerful people: admire from a distance, then leave quickly. He was calculating how many steps it would take to reach the side corridor when the procession stopped. He didn't notice at first. He was examining a seal ring that looked almost compatible with his water system. Then the vendor in front of him went rigid. The Vayan traders 2 stalls over stopped pulsing entirely. When Rael finally turned, the procession was no longer at the far end of the concourse. The Empress Regent was 20 feet away, and she was not looking at the market or the crowd, or her guards who were speaking to her in low, urgent tones she was clearly ignoring. She was looking at Rael's forearm. He followed her gaze. His left sleeve had ridden up past the wrist. On the inside of his forearm, visible just below the cuff, was the tattoo he had carried since before he could remember asking where it came from, a set of angular lines forming a symbol he had never been able to fully identify, part compass, part medical glyph, part something else entirely. His father had drawn it on him when Rael was 5, pressed his thumb to it, and said, "So you know where you come from, even when I can't tell you." He had never thought much about it since. The Empress Regent took 3 steps forward. Her guards closed with her immediately, weapons not raised, but hands moving. She waved them back without looking. She stopped front of Rael. Up close, her eyes were extraordinary, pale silver gray with a dark inner ring, carrying the specific weight of someone who had seen a great deal and filed it all carefully away. She stared at his forearm the way someone stared at a word in a language they thought they had forgotten. "Human," she said. Her voice was low, precise, controlled. "Where did you get that mark?" Rael considered several responses. Most of them were unwise. He settled on the truth. "My father gave it to me, a long time ago." The Empress Regent went very still. Around them, the entire market had ceased to function as a market and become, instead, an audience. "What was his name?" she asked. Rael told her. Something crossed her face then, not grief exactly, but the echo of it, the shape grief leaves behind after it has moved through a person and they have survived it. "You will come with me," she said. Rael looked down at the filtration seal still in his hand. He set it carefully back on the rack. "I was in the middle of something," he said. "I am aware," she said. "You will come anyway." And because arguing with the Empress Regent of the Drassian Confederacy in the middle of a crowded market was the sort of thing that ended careers and occasionally lives, Rael Doss followed a woman he had never met into a future he had not planned for, with no explanation and a tattoo that had apparently meant something to someone for a very long time. What survives a war? The Empress Regent's vessel was not what Rael expected. He had imagined something imposing, heavy plating, ceremonial excess, the physical expression of authority that rulers tended to favor. What waited on the private platform above the market was sleek and restrained, the color of deep water, with no insignia at all. A ship that could disappear into a crowd of other ships without effort. A ship that had been chosen, Rael realized, not for display, but for survival. He filed that away. The interior was equally sparse. Clean surfaces, adaptive seating, a long observation panel that framed the stars with unusual clarity, as if the ship had been designed to make the view feel real rather than decorative. The guards positioned themselves at the rear. Rael was placed, politely, firmly, in a seat across from the Empress Regent. She watched him for the first few minutes of flight in silence. Rael let the silence happen. He had learned over years of moving between systems and cultures that silence was not always empty. Sometimes it was doing the work that words couldn't. "You look like him," she said at last. "I keep not knowing what to do with it," Rael replied. "Have others recognized the mark?" "No." He pulled his sleeve up slightly, looking at it. "Honestly, I assumed it was something personal, something he made up." "He did not make it up," Sorvan said. "It is a field medic certification mark.
used by several human medical volunteer corps operating during the peripheral wars. It identified battlefield healers operating outside any military chain of command, independent, neutral, protected under wartime treaty in theory. She paused. In practice, it often meant they were captured rather than killed, because they were more useful alive. Rael said nothing. "Your father," she continued, "was captured during the 3rd year of the war. He was taken to a detention facility above the moon Karath, a processing center. They did not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants there. Everyone was a number. Everyone was a resource." The stars moved past the observation panel in slow silence. "I was there," she said. "I was not Empress Regent then. I was a junior military attaché from a minor noble house captured during an intelligence operation that failed in ways I could not have predicted. I was 23 years old. I had been trained for tactics, for strategy, for the ordered application of force. I had not been trained for captivity." She folded her hands together on the surface of the table between them. Even the gesture was controlled, but barely. "The facility broke people deliberately," she said. "Irregular feeding cycles, disrupted sleep, isolation. They were efficient about it. Most prisoners deteriorated within the 1st month. I was deteriorating by the 2nd week." Her voice did not waver, but it slowed. "There was a human medic in the adjacent section. He had found ways to move between prisoner blocks. I never learned how, and I did not ask. He appeared when things were worst." Rael kept his face neutral. He was very good at that. It had taken practice. "He had almost nothing," Sorvan continued. "His few supplies he had somehow retained or traded for. His skills, and an extraordinary refusal to behave as the situation demanded. He made bad jokes, deliberately bad, as if the badness of the joke itself was the point, as if laughter at something terrible was a form of resistance." "It was," Rael said quietly.
He shared rations he should have kept. He taught me techniques for managing pain responses, breathing patterns, focus anchoring, methods for making suffering smaller in the mind, even when it could not be made smaller in the body. Something shifted in her expression. He treated every prisoner he reached. Drassian, Herath, Vayan, human. It did not matter to him. He was incapable of the distinction. Rael looked at the tattoo on his forearm, the lines that formed the old medical mark. He traced the edge of it with one finger. "What happened to him?" he asked, even though some part of him already knew. Sorvan was quiet for a moment. The ship banked slightly, and the stars realigned. There was an opportunity for a group of prisoners to reach a transport relay, a narrow window, enough space for perhaps a dozen people to move undetected. He organized it. He knew the facility's patterns by then. He had spent 2 years learning them, the way a medic learns a patient's rhythms. A pause. He gave his space in the group to a Drassian prisoner who was too injured to move quickly. He stayed behind to cover the timing, to delay discovery. Her voice, for the first time, thinned slightly at the edges. He was successful. The group reached the relay. They survived. He did not. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and shape. Rael exhaled slowly. He pressed his thumb against the tattoo and held it there. "He mentioned a child," Sorvan said, "once, when the facility had been particularly difficult and he was allowing himself the small luxury of honesty.
He said he had a child he had left behind, and that the thing he feared most was not dying, it was being forgotten. Rael closed his eyes, just for a moment. He wasn't, he said, forgotten. He wasn't. He opened them again. I didn't know the whole story, but I knew him. I knew enough, and I carried the mark because he asked me to. Sorvan studied him with those extraordinary pale eyes, as if recalibrating something internal. I returned home after the war. I rose through politics and strategy and the complicated machinery of the Drassian power for the next 17 years. I became what I became, and I never found him. I looked. I searched records, prisoner logs, everything available. He had been processed out of existence by a system that did not see him as a person. Her chin lifted slightly. Until today, until a man with his face and his mark was standing in a market arguing with a parts vendor about seal compatibility. In my defense, the vendor was wrong about the compatibility. Something extraordinary happened then. The Empress Regent of the Drassian Confederacy, ruler of 19 star systems, survivor of a war that had reshaped the known frontier. She almost laughed. It was the smallest sound, barely a sound at all, but it was real. He argued in exactly that tone, she said, quiet conviction, as if the facts were personally offended by being misrepresented. Rael looked out at the stars. He thought about a man in a prison above a dead moon, sharing food he couldn't spare, teaching pain management to alien soldiers, making deliberately terrible jokes because the awfulness of the joke itself was the point. He thought about what it cost to be that person every single day in a place designed to destroy exactly that kind of person. He was the most stubborn man I ever knew, Rael said, and I knew him for 6 years, which wasn't enough and never will be. He met her gaze. But he'd be glad you lived. He'd be glad you're this. He would consider it the best possible outcome. Sorvan fell. Empress Regent was quiet for a long moment. As would I, she said finally. As would I.
The weight of a name. The palace on Drassian Prime was everything Vethera Station was not. It rose from the capital city in a series of sweeping architectural arches, pale stone layered with bioluminescent threading that pulsed slowly at night like something breathing. The corridors were wide enough to feel like outdoor spaces. The ceilings were high and curved. Every surface had been chosen to endure for centuries, not because the Drassians feared change, but because they believed that the places where important things happened should carry the memory of them. Rael had been given chambers that could have fit his entire ship inside with room remaining. He stood at the window on the first evening and looked out at a city that moved with the careful, unhurried confidence of a civilization that had long since decided it was going to be here tomorrow. He thought about his father. Not the absent father, not the shape of the man he had grown up constructing from silence and guesswork. The man Sorvan had described, the one who had looked at a failing body in a foreign prison and thought, I can make this smaller. Who had looked at alien soldiers, soldiers of a side that had been shooting at humans not long before, and thought, you are in pain and I have something that helps. Who told terrible jokes, who had given his seat to a stranger, who had chosen at the end to stay so that others could move. Rael pressed his palm against the cool window glass. He was afraid of being forgotten. That was the thing that undid him.
Not the sacrifice. He could hold the sacrifice at a respectful distance, honor it without being consumed by it. But the fear, the very human, entirely ordinary fear that you would pass through the world and leave no trace. He had left a trace. He had left one in the woman who now ruled 19 star systems, who had searched prisoner logs for 17 years, who had crossed a crowded market because she recognized a mark on a stranger's arm. And he had left one in Rael, who had carried that mark on his forearm since before he was old enough to understand it, and had known, always, without ever being told, that it mattered. The council session happened on the third day. Rael was not invited. He attended anyway, arriving 3 minutes early, which he had found to be the most effective way to be somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, not late enough to cause drama, not early enough to be turned away. The chamber was circular, with ascending, curved tiers of seating arranged around a central speaking floor. A dozen senior Drassian officials occupied the upper tiers. Sorvan stood at the center, composed and still. Her bone-ridge crests, the Drassian indicator of status and bearing, were perfectly level, which meant she was managing something difficult. She saw Rael enter. Her eyes tracked to him for precisely 1 second, then back to the council. She did not ask him to leave. He took a position near the back wall. The concerns were not subtle. He caught enough of the proceedings. The council spoke a formal dialect of Drassian that he only partially understood, but tone required no translation. He heard the words for complication and human and historical leverage with some frequency. He saw hands gesture in his direction more than once. After a while, Sorvan turned and looked at him directly. "Rael Doss," she said in the common trade tongue, making it formal by saying it in full. "The council wishes to understand your intentions." Rael walked to the center floor. The curved seating above him felt like a physical pressure. He stood in it and did not adjust his posture, because adjusting his posture would have meant acknowledging that he was uncomfortable, and that would give the pressure somewhere to go. "I don't have intentions. I had a shopping list. The list had 4 items. I only got to 2 of them." A ripple of something moved through the council tiers, not laughter, closer to recalibration. "You are the son of a man who saved the Empress Regent's life," one counselor said, the oldest of them by the looks of it, gray even by Drassian standards, with bone ridge crests that had taken on the slight upward curve that indicated advanced age. "That gives you standing in Drassian law, political standing. It can be used." "By whom?" Rael asked. "By anyone who chooses to claim it." "I'm not claiming it. I didn't earn it. My father earned it. I'm just the person who showed up with his face and his tattoo." "That is precisely why it has value," another counselor said, younger, sharper, with the particular impatience of someone used to thinking 3 moves ahead. "Symbols do not require intention to function. You will be used whether you choose to or not." Rael thought about that. "You're right. People use things. That's what people do." He looked at Sorvan. "But there's a difference between what other people do with a symbol and what the symbol actually means." He turned back to the council. "My father was a medic in a prison. He didn't represent humanity. He didn't represent anything except himself, a person who had decided, under conditions designed to destroy that decision, that other people's pain was worth his energy and his food and eventually his life." He paused. "You want to use that for politics. Fine, but understand what you're actually using. You're using the fact that one human, with nothing to gain, chose every single day to be decent. Not strategic, not calculated, decent." The chamber was very quiet.
"He wasn't a symbol," Rael continued. "He was a man. and the man was better than the symbol will ever be. He looked at Sorvan one more time. She was watching him with an expression he didn't have the vocabulary for yet, something layered, something that had been assembled from more years of experience than he had lived. He gave her a small nod. She returned it. The council did not adjourn so much as dissolve slowly, like something heavy breaking down under its own weight. Officials moved to side conversations. The sharp younger counselor stared at Rael with the particular attention of someone revising their assessment. Sorvan walked to where Rael stood. "You speak with his precision," she said, "the way he could reduce something complicated to its essential truth without losing the weight of it." "I didn't know I was doing that," Rael said. "I know," she replied. "That is what makes it real." They stood in the emptying chamber while the echoes settled. "He was afraid of being forgotten," Rael said again. Not to her, not to anyone in particular, just aloud, because it needed to be said somewhere real. Sorvan looked at him for a long time. "In Drassian culture," she said quietly, "we have a concept that does not translate perfectly into common speech. Roughly, the living proof of a life well spent." She looked at his forearm, at the mark that had started all of this. "You are that, Rael Doss, not because of what your father did, because of who you chose to be, carrying the weight of a man you barely knew, without bitterness and without complaint." She paused. "He would have been proud of you, not for today, for every day before it. Every unremarkable day you carried that mark through systems that did not know it and lived your life without requiring it to mean anything." Rael was quiet for a long moment. "He was afraid of being forgotten," he said one final time. "He shouldn't have been." Somewhere in the architecture of the vast Drassian palace, something shifted. It might have been air. It might have been light adjusting as the star outside moved its angle. It felt to Rael like a door closing gently on a room that had been left open for 17 years. And in every star system that would eventually hear this story, through official dispatches and travelers' accounts and the way stories move between people who need them, the Drassian Confederacy would come to understand something that would recalibrate their understanding of humans entirely. Not that humans were strong, not that they were clever, not that they were resilient in the specific ways that soldiers are resilient, but that humans were capable of a peculiar, almost irrational, deeply stubborn form of grace. A grace that did not require an audience, that did not require survival to be its own reward, that did not ask what it would receive in return. A grace that showed up in prisons, in markets, in council chambers, wearing worn jackets and carrying tattoos and arguing about filtration seals. A grace that persisted across 17 years and 19 star systems and the long silences between the stars. And the Drassian Confederacy, which had spent centuries building systems of precise reciprocity and measured obligation, had no framework for that kind of grace. Which meant, for the first time in a very long time, they had something to learn. The Council's second thoughts. By the 5th day, Rael had developed a working theory about the palace. It was alive, not biologically, not in any way that would register on a scan, but in the way that very old structures absorb the lives of the people who move through them, until the building itself carries a kind of accumulated attention. Every corridor he walked seemed slightly aware of him.
Servants appeared at relevant moments. Doors opened a half-second before he reached them. He mentioned this to the steward assigned to him, a young Drassian named Veleth, serious and efficient, who had initially regarded Rael with the careful wariness reserved for diplomatic wildcards and unstable machinery. "The palace has adaptive environmental systems," Veleth said. "They recalibrate to recognized residents." "When did I become a recognized resident?" Veleth asked. Veleth paused. 3 days ago, the Empress Regent authorized the registry update personally. Rael absorbed this. "Does that happen often for visitors?" "No," Veleth said. Rael sat with that for a while. The council had not dissolved permanently, of course. They reconvened on the 5th day, this time with considerably more preparation. He was formally invited, which he found both more comfortable and more worrying. Formal invitations meant formal expectations. Formal expectations meant people had already decided what the meeting was for. He went anyway, because not going would have meant the council shaped the conversation without him, and he had learned, from years of arriving late to other people's plans, that absence rarely protected you from their conclusions. The chamber was the same, the officials were the same, but the energy was different, less reactive, more deliberate. They had spent 4 days considering him. He could see it in the way they held themselves, the particular stillness of people who have prepared arguments. The sharp younger counselor, Rael had learned her name was Adris Vorin, Director of Strategic Continuity, which was either a very important title or a very meaningless one, depending on what continuity meant in this context, spoke first. "We have reviewed the historical record," she said. "The prisoner incident at Karath, the escape of 11 individuals, the subsequent careers of each survivor." She set a data panel flat on the table between them. 2 of them entered Confederacy governance, 1 became a senior medical administrator, 3 returned to military service, the others built lives we consider ordinary by most measures. She looked at Rael. "The human medic's actions created a chain of consequences that directly contributed to post-war reconstruction in 3 contested systems. This is not metaphor. We ran the analysis." Rael looked at the data panel. He didn't touch it. "He didn't know that," Rael said. "No," Adris agreed. "He did not, which is what makes the data significant." She leaned forward slightly. "We operate on the principle that actions which cannot be verified in outcome should be weighted by intention and probability. Your father had no reliable probability of any positive outcome. The rational model predicts non-intervention in approximately 93% of comparable scenarios." "What does the rational model say about the 7%? Rael asked. Adris paused. "That it represents a category of decision-making that our models classify as inefficient." "But it built the thing that worked," Rael said. Silence. "Yes," Adris said, after a moment.
Sorvan had been quiet at the head of the chamber through this exchange. Now she spoke. "Director Vorin's point is that the Confederacy has been attempting to quantify what your father did, to find its structural logic." She looked at Rael. "I suspect you are going to tell us why that is the wrong approach." "I'm going to tell you that he didn't have a structural logic," Rael said. "He had a value. One value held very firmly, that the person in front of him was worth his effort. Not because of the math, not because of what they could do for him later, because they were there and they were suffering and he had something that could help. He pushed the data panel slightly to the side. The model calls it inefficient because it's measuring the wrong output. He wasn't optimizing for outcomes, he was optimizing for the person in front of him, every time, without exception. The chamber was quiet in a different way than it had been before, more textured, the kind of quiet that meant people were actually thinking rather than waiting for their turn to speak. Old Counselor Sereth, the eldest of the group, who had been watching Rael with half-closed eyes since the session began, spoke for the first time. His voice was slow and deep, and carried the particular authority of someone who had been saying important things for a very long time. "In the early period of Drassian expansion," he said, "we encountered a dozen species. We categorized them all, by technological capability, by territorial behavior, by resource utilization, by conflict patterns." He paused. "We categorized humans as moderate capability, high volatility, unpredictable social cohesion." He looked at Rael with those half-closed eyes. "We were wrong about the last item. We interpreted your social behavior as unstable because it did not follow predictable patterns. We did not understand that the unpredictability was the mechanism, that humans extend care outside logical parameters because the logical parameters are not what determine the extension." Rael sat with that. "That's the most accurate thing anyone's ever said about us," he said. "And honestly, it still sounds like a flaw when you say it out loud." "It is not a flaw," Sereth said. "A predictable system can be anticipated and countered. An unpredictably generous system cannot be defended against because there is nothing to defend against." He settled back in his seat. "Your father walked into a prison built to create despair and produced 11 survivors and 17 years of political consequence because he was incapable of being predicted into inaction." Rael looked at his forearm. "He'd hate being called a strategic asset," he said. "I know," Sorvan said, and for a brief moment her composure carried something warm in it. "We are not calling him that. We are calling him what he was." She looked at the council. "A man who chose to be what the situation argued against, and whose choice outlasted everyone who built the situation." After the session, Rael found his way to the outer terraces, the ones that faced away from the city, looking instead at the rough terrain beyond, hills covered in the dark blue-green vegetation native to Drassian Prime, valleys where thin rivers caught the light of the distant sun and turned it silver. Valeth appeared, which Rael had come to expect. "The council has voted to formally acknowledge the historical record. The Karath incident will be reclassified from a minor prisoner processing event to a significant humanitarian action. The human medic will be named in the official record." Rael was quiet for a moment. "His name was Rael Doss. He was 34 years old when he was captured. He grew up on a station called Pallery Junction in the Outer Hegemony territories. He told bad jokes because his own father told bad jokes, and he thought it was a form of inheritance worth keeping." Valeth was recording. Rael let him. "He was afraid of being forgotten. He was wrong to be afraid." Below, the silver rivers moved between the dark hills, carrying light from a sun that had been burning long before any of this, and would continue burning long after. Rael stayed on the terrace until the light changed. He was beginning to understand that his ship was going to wait a little longer.
What he left to be found. Rael Doss left Drassian Prime on the morning of the 12th day. Not because the palace had asked him to leave, and not because he had run out of reasons to stay. He left because he had done the thing that needed doing, and leaving was how he honored the fact that it was complete. Sorvan walked him to the launch platform. This surprised him.
the first time anything in the palace had surprised him in several days. She came without ceremony, wearing the same spare, functional garments she had worn on her ship the first day. No clasp at the throat this time, just cloth and the cool morning air, and the sound of her footsteps on the stone. She carried something in her hands, a small object, flat and rectangular, sealed in a protective case. "What is that?" Rael asked. "A recorded testimony," she said, "compiled from the statements of every surviving prisoner from the Kareth facility that we have been able to locate." She held it out. They had all been asked at various points in their lives about the human medic, what they remembered, what he said, what he did. We assembled the accounts. She paused. "You should have them, not because you need them, but because they belong to you." Rael took the case. It was lighter than he expected. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, or rather, the weight of what it represented, which was considerably more than the object itself. 11 people, Rael said. 11 at Kareth, Sorvan said, and the people those 11 went on to affect, and the people after them. She looked at him steadily. The analysis Director Vorin presented only captured direct causation. The actual propagation of consequence is unmeasurable. It is simply too large. Rael tucked the case carefully into his jacket pocket. He would have laughed at that, Rael said. He would have said something self-deprecating and slightly absurd about consequences being somebody else's problem. Yes, he would have. They stood at the edge of the platform. The steadfast complaint sat 20 meters away, a little battered, slightly stubborn, ready in the way that faithful machines were always ready, without fuss, without requirements, simply there. "I have something to ask you," Sorvan said. Rael looked at her. Not as Empress Regent, just as someone who owes more than she can repay to a man who is gone and has found that the only available path for that debt is forward. She quieted for a moment, reassembled. "I am asking if you would be willing to return, not as a symbol, not as a political instrument, as someone I can speak to honestly about a man we both knew differently and together understood better than either of us understood alone." Rael looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the steadfast complaint and the routes he had mapped and the comfortable solitude of a life that moved and never required him to be anything particular to anyone particular. He thought about his father, 34 years old in a facility above a dead moon, looking at a Drassian soldier he had no particular reason to help and choosing to help her. Not because it was strategic, because she was there. "I'll come back," Rael said. "Not right away. I have places to be and a filtration seal to actually purchase." He patted his jacket pocket. "But I'll come back." Sorvan's expression changed, not dramatically, not in the way that made for easy description, just slightly, a releasing of something that had been held carefully for a very long time. "I will be here," she said.
"I know," Rael said. "You've been here for 17 years. A few more months isn't going to surprise you." A sound escaped her, quiet, real, unheld. The laugh she had been trying not to have since the transport. "He laughed exactly like that," she said, when it was over, as if the laugh surprised him more than the joke. "Inherited trait," Rael said. He stepped toward the ramp, then stopped. He had been composing this in his head since the terrace. He wanted to get it right. "When people ask about him," Rael said, "when they ask about the human medic in the Kareth facility, about what he was and why he did what he did, don't call it bravery. Bravery implies he overcame fear. He might have, I don't know." He looked at the case inside his jacket. Call it what it actually was. A man who decided in a place built to convince people that other people don't matter, that other people matter. Every day. Without an audience, without a guarantee, without anything except the decision itself, made again and again until there were no more days to make it in. He looked at Sorvan one last time. "That's what we are," he said. "That's the human thing. Not the tech, not the warfare, not the exploration. The decision to keep deciding that the person in front of us is worth our energy, even when everything around us is saying they're not." Sorvan fell, Empress Regent of the Drassian Confederacy, survivor of a war that had carved its shape into her for 17 years, looked at the son of the man who had kept her alive in the worst of it, and said nothing. Because some things did not require a response. Because some things simply needed to be heard by someone who had the authority to carry them forward. Rael walked up the ramp. It sealed behind him with a soft hydraulic sigh. He settled into the pilot seat, pressed his palm to the startup panel, listened to the ship's systems come awake. He pulled out the sealed case and set it on the console in front of him, where he could see it. 11 testimonies. 11 lives his father had reached into at the cost of his own and pulled forward into the future. 11 threads connecting a dead moon above a forgotten conflict to a palace on a planet that was now going to change how it taught its people to think about humans. Because one man had been incapable of being predicted into an action. The steadfast complaint lifted from the platform on a column of quiet thrust. Through the forward panel, Rael watched the palace grow small, then smaller, then become just another part of the city's organized beauty, and then just a point of light on a planet's surface, and then nothing at all. He set a course to the nearest trading post with a decent parts inventory. He had a filtration seal to buy. And after that, after the 1,000 small, ordinary things that made a life in motion, he would come back to Drassian Prime and sit in a room with a queen who had survived a war, and they would talk about a man who was afraid of being forgotten. And in the talking of it, they would make sure he never was. The stars opened ahead of him like a question he was no longer afraid to answer. He pressed his thumb to the tattoo on his forearm, the medic's mark, the inheritance, the thread, and flew.